members of Friends, East West Center community, and those of you joining us for the first time. We take great pride in the fact that this is one of the largest signups for China Seminar this season. We're honored today to have as our speaker AlexCKaufman. Alex is an award-winning journalist and writer who covers energy policy and climate change across 4 continents. He served 11 years as senior energy reporter at the news website HuffPost. Alex is the inaugural recipient of the East West Center's Melvin M.S. Gu Writing Fellowship. The fellowship provided support for some of the reporting in this talk. On a personal note, I knew the late Melvin Gu when we worked together on the staff at the Honolulu Advertiser. Mel was a dedicated journalist who was a recipient of the prestigious Nieman Fellowship at Harvard and later earned a law degree. Mel went on to edit publications in Asia. I'm sure Mel would be pleased that the fund set up in his name supports work such as AlexCKaufman's. Following Alex's talk, East West Center Adjunct Senior Fellow Rick Hornick will moderate the Q&A discussion. Alex, the floor is now yours.
Thank you for such a kind introduction, Gerald, and thank you to all of you for being here and to the East West Center for both hosting this and for supporting my reporting on this subject. I will do my best to keep my remarks fairly brief and straightforward at the beginning, as I'd really like to be able to make this a nice conversation and get to the Q&A portion. As a journalist, my instinct is to allow for the questions. So I figured I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself, how I came upon this story, and what I learned throughout the course of reporting it. So I have been a reporter for quite some time and have covered the energy transition for the past 11 years. Throughout that time, China has loomed quite large over much of my reporting, but largely because of its renewables manufacturing and usage. It is by far the superpower in both producing solar panels and the batteries needed to back them up and wind turbines, and has really been really the leader in that space for quite a while. I really became interested in nuclear energy about 3 to 4 years ago. The first big story I did was in Finland, where I was attending a different kind of press junket, and I was looking for a good story to tell while I was there. And Finland at that point had just completed work on the world's first permanent repository for nuclear waste. So I went to visit it. And when I finished reporting there and came back, the story turned out to be quite successful. And the next month I was in the Netherlands for another conference. I guess I should have mentioned at the top, I'm based in New York City. And I visited the nuclear power plant that is in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, and ended up doing a large story on that country's relationship to nuclear power. And by the end of that year, I was in Taiwan, where I not only visited many of the nuclear plants that were being shut down by the government there, but also went to Orchid Island, or Lanyu Island, the home of one of the more distinctive Aboriginal groups in Taiwan, the Tao people, and also the site of a large scandal over a nuclear waste repository site there that was brought on by the Kuomintang government in the 1980s, and became sort of a fixture in the politics of the Democratic Progressive Party ever since. And for the next year or two, I was doing additional reporting both in Asia, in Latin America, and in Europe on nuclear power. Throughout this time, naturally, China loomed quite large. It really, for almost as long as I've been alive, I'm just shy of 34, nuclear power has been in recession in the West. The United States has only built 2 new reactors from scratch in really the past several decades. And when I say from scratch, I mean that there was one reactor at the Tennessee Valley Authority that had been started, about 50 years before it was finally completed after a series of stops and starts in in 2016. It came online. But 2 reactors, a pair of Westinghouse AP1000s, this model of reactor that was designed in the early 2000s to be the workhorse of a new American renaissance in nuclear power, back when that was planned in the early 2000s, prior to the events at Fukushima. They were the first 2 were meant to be built at this plant called Plant Vogtle in Georgia. And this facility was, or these reactors at this facility are what are called Gen 3 reactors, which broadly defines the fact that they have these passive safety features. So if something happens along the lines of what we saw happen at Fukushima in almost exactly, 15 years ago, 16 years ago now, in March 2011, they were where the generators that served to provide backup power to keep the reactors cool and avoid a meltdown were flooded and disabled, and a meltdown did indeed occur there. With these units, these AP1000s, they're designed basically to use a really fail-proof thing to avoid a meltdown, which is gravity. So if something, they can halt the reaction simply by dropping, a part of the reactor within the unit. And this type of technology was widely sought after. It was very exciting. The United States was very excited to build them broadly. And then, there were many problems that came out of this. One of them was just the fact that the design was not complete at the time that they started to actually build them. So they were able to, so they had to keep going back to nuclear regulators in order to fix, get new approvals to make little tweaks. And that happened over and over again. The fact that these were financed privately at a high interest rate meant that each delay made everything more and more expensive. And before long, these projects became, tens of billions of dollars over budget and very delayed. And, the promise of building a bunch of them that had existed at the start of the 2000s really went away when the world sort of turned against nuclear once again after Fukushima. But during this time, China managed to build 4 of them, and those 4 were completed and online before the first of these 2 in Georgia actually came online in 2023. The second one came online last summer. And now, this is being looked at once again in the United States as the great promise for the future, that this technology needs to be deployed. Yes, there's excitement about these small modular reactors, but most of the calculations that we have from one of the leading economists who looks at this stuff at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology show that the next cheapest and easiest reactor to build in the United States will in fact be another AP1000. And the big open question is, are we going to be able to do them here? And are we going to be able to sell them abroad, which has been the policy of both the Trump administration the first time around and the Biden administration that just left and is likely to be considered, part of the Trump administration's goals as well, now that it's back. And that is a big question because China in this time not only managed to build 4 and order several more, China, and in doing so, provide a lot of lessons that allowed the United States to actually finish the 2 that we had underway in Georgia. China managed to actually reverse engineer it and create its own version of the reactor. One of those is called the Hualong 1. And the other one is actually, it's not just reverse engineered, it's actually made larger, and it's the CAP 1400. And each of these reactors rely on domestic supply chains in China. They also, have been built with experienced workers in China, something of which there is a shortage in the United States and much of the West because of how few new reactors have been constructed in the West over the past 30 to 40 years. But, they also benefit from the very things that helped China to complete those mega projects in the first place. And those include state-backed low-interest loans, something the likes of which the U.S. companies don't really have access to. And, that kind of just overall long-term government support, the likes of which U.S. companies don't really have access to. And, there are other factors, such as the way that electricity markets are designed. This is a challenging thing in the United States, that a lot of markets, such as the one where I live in New York, but also most of the United States, are under grids that basically hold auctions every hour and allow different electricity generators to compete for who can get the lowest price. And this has been really challenging for nuclear plants because they're very expensive upfront to build, especially compared to a natural gas-fired plant or a renewable plant. And the benefits of nuclear power compared to natural gas or those types of weather-dependent renewables doesn't really come through in the incentive structures that you have in those electricity markets. That's less true in a place that is still a regulated market like Georgia and much of the Southeast, which has maintained this more traditional monopoly model of the single utility owning both the power plant, the power lines, and then also selling that power directly to the customer, and then just having to answer to a public utility commissioner to determine what the fairest and best rates are to people. That kind of certainty and regulatory structure has been much better suited to carrying out these types of large-scale mega projects like building AP1000s. The other factor to consider here is that the United States grid is very old. It's disconnected in certain parts of the country, and we have really struggled to bring more power plants online as a result of that. China has the benefit of a newer grid, one that was built with more modern equipment, and one that is better interconnected. So the Chinese have really benefited from being able to create these essentially mega power plants that have several reactors all in one place, each of these reactors with enough power to power 1 million homes, and millions of homes then being powered by a relatively small piece of real estate. And that power could be shipped for hundreds of miles in any direction to the cities and the consumers where it's needed. And another factor to really consider here, that's a key difference, is China is not as rich in the fossil fuels that the United States is. The past administration, the Biden administration, was keen to wean the United States off fossil fuels in the name of fighting climate change and reducing the amount of toxic air pollution that we now have research linking it to everything from breast cancer and lung cancer and heart disease to dementia and even erectile dysfunction. But that hasn't necessarily sunk in with certain parts of the American polity yet, and you have a real push back in the direction of being fully invested in expanding fossil fuel production and usage in the United States. And, that poses a real challenge to building new nuclear power plants in this country, because that is the thing that is the hardest, or that ideally a nuclear power plant is best suited to replacing fossil fuels. And, if fossil fuels are really cheap, as they are right now in the US, that becomes a bigger challenge to get people to want to support that. China doesn't have that problem. China not only obviously has the long-term industrial policy that can be set out by the Communist Party, and a commitment to these 5-year plans that allow for industrial policies to be carried out over a period of time and not changed every 2 to 4 years when you have an election and you have a party with kind of polarized opposite opinions and rolling back some of these things. But China is also doesn't have those same domestic supplies of oil and gas, and thus is perhaps a bit more committed to becoming what has been widely described as the world's first electro state. Kind of a contrast to the petro state moniker, where they are using electricity for more and more things in their daily lives, including, and most notably and most famous to many people, electric vehicles. They China vaulted to the front of the pack as the world's largest producer of automobiles. Now, we're not seeing them on the roads here in the United States because of the tariffs that were put in place to protect domestic suppliers. But, they are certainly showing up in other parts of the world. I have family in the UK that talk about seeing BYDs on the street. And, I have some friends in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia who, describe really nothing but Chinese electric cars showing up everywhere there. So, that they are certainly putting in the investments and building a pretty firm backbone, not just with the, greatest deployments of solar and batteries and wind of any other country, but the greatest deployments of nuclear reactors of any other country. And so, I think I'll close just on the idea that here in the United States, there has been this sort of debate within energy transition policy circles that tends to pit, renewables against nuclear, saying that, they don't pair well together and that, you can really choose one or the other. And, I think China offers a pretty powerful point of contrast in the sense that it's doing both. And that, if we are indeed going to decarbonize in this century, and if we are going to meet the growing and future needs of human populations for the electricity that we need, not just for the daily tasks that we all depend on it for today, but also for increased air conditioning, in an increasingly hot world, and for, all of these other tasks, running the data centers that are powering the AI revolution and keeping the internet up. And, whether or not you think crypto is something good, I think is, to each their own. But, certainly I didn't expect, Bitcoin mining to be as big a suck on the power grid as it is today. And I think the lesson to be taken from that is not any judgment about the innate value of Bitcoin and the blockchain, but that there are all kinds of uses for electricity that we can't even imagine today, perhaps, that will be around in the next 15 to 20 years. And so planning for that future and building for a future of absolute clean electricity abundance is probably a pretty smart way to prepare yourself for the 21st century. And that, between both the renewables and the nuclear power that China is now using, is doing a pretty good job of making sure that Beijing will be in a strong position. So with that, I thank you for letting me letting me talk at you, and now I'm eager to hear from you.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Alex. That was terrific, and you raised a lot of interesting points. Actually, just on a personal note, as a newly minted energy reporter for Time magazine in 1979, one of my first stories was 3 Mile Island, which is what actually threw the U.S. nuclear industry into such a long tailspin. A couple of things I'd like to clear up. So the Chinese started with these 4 reactors. They were based on Westinghouse? Were those were Westinghouse engineers involved in building them? And what was the time frame a little bit?
That's right. So I want to first stress, to make clear, these were not the first 4 reactors in China.
Right.
China began building nuclear power in the 1980s. They worked pretty closely with the U.S. at various points, and including Westinghouse, but also with the French state nuclear company EDF. And they continue to work with EDF on various European designs that they have used in China as well. But yeah, these projects started in the 2010s in China. They were partnerships with Westinghouse. And there was this belief in the 2010s that, the future of a lot of these American designs could be sorted out in China, with Chinese construction, and, perhaps made easier than to build in the United States, because, they knew that they could rely on these Chinese state-owned utilities to be able to have these low-interest Chinese state-backed loans that would make it possible to get these things going and work out the kinks so they could be brought back here where, you have the private market issues a little more directly. Another example of this is the Bill Gates backed nuclear startup TerraPower, which uses a different type of design that instead of using water as a coolant, it's using a liquid metal that allows for temperatures to get a little hotter. There are various reasons and technical benefits to this. There are also some technical drawbacks. But TerraPower had planned on building its first reactors in China. And what ultimately happened is that under the first Trump administration, there were sanctions put in place on Chinese nuclear amid allegations of corporate espionage and theft and IP issues. And the only company that ended up having an exemption to continue working in China was Westinghouse, so that it could complete these projects. So, Westinghouse did help to construct it and help to oversee construction. They, transferred some of this technology, a decision that is being questioned now by some who say, that we gave away the goods, we gave away the secret sauce recipe, and now they've made their own version that will be competing against the U.S. and Westinghouse in export markets probably fairly soon. But yeah, that's how that went.
So, so just briefly, and in terms of export markets, is Westinghouse active overseas at this point?
Very much so. So Westinghouse, notably, I refer to it as an American company, and it remains headquartered in Pittsburgh, where it started in the 1950s. But it actually is. It was owned by Toshiba for a while, and then has since been transferred to a Canadian half. It's half owned by a Canadian hedge fund and half owned by Cameco, the largest Canadian miner of uranium. So in some ways is a Canadian company, although it remains, the sort of lead American firm. I guess if Trump has his way with some of the statehood stuff, maybe there won't be such a distinction there after all. But that they have for a long time operated in other countries. The lead project right now, which is supposed to help to demonstrate that the United States can once again actually export its reactors abroad, is a project in Poland to build Poland's first nuclear power plant. And they are hoping that they're planning to have AP1000s there, backed by a loan from the U.S. federal government. And beyond that, Westinghouse doesn't just produce reactors, it also produces, fuel assemblies and things like that. And so what has been happening over the last 3 years since the Ukraine invasion is a lot of these Russian-made nuclear power plants in countries like Slovakia and Romania are now sort of retrofitting to be able to use Westinghouse fuel assemblies so that they no longer have to buy nuclear fuel from the Russian state-owned nuclear company Rosatom.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Bev Burden has a really interesting question. It sort of, in a way, rephrases something that you were saying, but I'll just read it straight. Do you think that China has been early to recognize the symbiotic relationship between nuclear power innovations and AI, as evidenced by their various nuclear projects within the China Belt and Road partners?
That's a good question. I'm not so sure about the last part necessarily, with the tie-in to Belt and Road.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think that, China recognized early on, that, many future industries, including AI, would be, sort of, that the bottleneck for those things would be the available supply of electricity to make that work, and that they have been investing heavily in that throughout this time. It's notable sort of now that the United States is only really getting serious about upgrading our aging grid. And when I say aging grid, I mean certain parts of the equipment of the grid should have been replaced probably 10 to 20, if not more, years ago, and they're still in operation today. And we're seeing the effects of that in terms of, an increasing amount of blackouts. So the duration of time that the average American spends disconnected from the power grid has almost doubled since 2013. Which is pretty significant and pretty disturbing when you consider that in these increasing heat waves that we're seeing due to climate change, that access to your air conditioner can be life-saving in many situations. And I think China, we are starting to recognize that now. Unfortunately, the climate implications probably weren't enough to drive the investment in the US the same way that the AI boom now is. But certainly it seems like China, recognized the importance of this early on, certainly earlier than the United States did.
Brenda Scheinmel has the sort of the elephant in the room question, which is nuclear waste.
Yeah.
We still in the U.S. still talking about burying it somewhere in Nevada. What does China have some great answer to this, or they just have more disposable areas that they can bury it?
So, I think an important thing to understand, about nuclear waste is that the volumes of it are much smaller than people think. So, the United States has 94 reactors that are in operation today. At our peak, it was about 113. So that is more than any other country, although China is likely to surpass us probably by 2030, if not a little beyond that point. And we've been using it consistently, since the 1950s. So after all that time, all of the spent nuclear fuel, this really toxic stuff, the stuff you really don't want anything to do with, it would be, it could, if it were stacked on top of each other, would fit in essentially a single Walmart supercenter. So really not that large. And for context, I always like to point out to people that, I've been to a number of coal plants across the country, including the largest one in Puerto Rico, and the piles of ash that form from coal ash, they're out in the open in many cases. They're typically kept in containment pools that frequently rip and leach into groundwater or rivers. And they're filled with, toxic arsenic and other types of heavy metals that, I don't think, the cesium and other types of radioactive waste are really horrible too, and they don't decay at time scales that are relevant to our lives, but they actually do decay over time. So, I think in general, the concern over the volume, or, I think few people that I've met recognize how little nuclear waste is actually generated as as a percentage of the electrons that are being produced, to say nothing of not just the coal ash, but all of the particulate matter and CO2 and methane that is going into the atmosphere from coal and gas and oil, and causing bigger problems than just what happens when you breathe it in.
Right. It's a big NIMBY problem, though, I suppose.
Of course, and I'll just say one more thing, which is that yes, there is this discussion about places that you could keep it in the long term. Yucca Mountain was obviously a big and controversial issue in the United States, but actually, there's another solution, which is recycling it. So Russians recycle nuclear waste, the French recycle nuclear waste, the Japanese ship their nuclear waste to France to be recycled. And the action of recycling it is pretty productive one. You can really get out a lot of the more toxic materials that you really don't want anything to do with, and you can also generate a lot of these other types of fuel that are needed for some of those newer types of reactors that use coolants other than water, like the Bill Gates one. And on top of that, it actually contains a lot of these super rare radioisotopes that are sought after for a lot of experimental cancer treatments, like things like actinium. And so, you have a number of different firms now, both in the United States and in other countries, that are looking to do more nuclear waste recycling in order to harvest those things and also to kind of close the loop on the fuel cycle.
Sanskriti Yadav has posed a question, which I admit I don't fully understand, but I think it's a technical issue. Anyway, he says China is increasingly integrating AI, blockchain, and quantum computing into nuclear grid management. Given the dual-use risks of cyber vulnerabilities in nuclear systems, how do you see China's approach to nuclear cybersecurity governance comparing to Western models like the US NRC cyber resilience framework?
So, I would say in general, the United States and the West is much more open and connected, and that we are not quite as we are, we broadly speaking are pretty innately opposed to some of the network limits that obviously exist in a country like China with state-backed censorship and the Great Firewall and everything like that. Nuclear reactors in the U.S. at least are kind of a different story. Nuclear power plants are not connected to the internet in the United States. They are very siloed off from anything like that, and there are really, really strict militaristic protocols to prevent any kinds of connections like that, particularly given that we've seen a rise in cyber attacks on different types of electrical equipment in the US, some of it allegedly coming from Chinese hackers. And so I would my reporting didn't go as in depth into this as I would like to, as I wish I did, so that I could answer this with greater specificity. But my overall hunch and assumption from the research that I did do and the people that I did talk to is that China has some pretty strict rules in place that mirror those that we have in place in the United States.
Do you see China, because it is so centrally controlled, being more successful than the United States in sort of creating a more manageable standard of nuclear power plant, like France? I mean, it's my understanding that the French reactors are, it's sort of like, buying Boeing 737s for an airline. Any nuclear operator can operate any of their plants. They're very much, whereas America has, many different kinds. Is China sort of committed to this one model, this, based originally on the Westinghouse, which then they're going?
China has a number of different models. They have both these ones based on the Westinghouse reactor. They have ones based on French EDF reactors. They have some of their own indigenous models, including the world's first land-based small modular reactor, which they're building in Hainan. Some really, the same family of reactor that many of these SMR companies in the US are now promoting. China actually built one, and it's connected to the grid of December. So they are working on a lot of different types of models. But what China is doing differently from the United States, and what you correctly identify, is that the US, even in the heyday of building reactors in the late 20th century, has always gone with all these different designs. So there's a sort of infamous example from the Pacific Northwest, which is known by the acronym WHOOPS, which I don't remember exactly. It's like the Washington something. It was in Washington State, and they were building out a big nuclear complex and decided to build like 4 or 5 reactors and 4 or 5 different designs. So each one was its own, multi-billion-dollar project with specific issues involved with it and challenges. And China, while it has, it is doing a lot and experimenting with a lot of different types of reactors, it kind of made the correct decision to build multiple ones of the same kind in the same place at the same time. So, in the US, with these 2 reactors in Georgia, Unit 3, which was the first of these AP1000s, was super expensive, and Unit 4 came online faster and was cheaper. And the assumption then is that a Unit 5 and 6 will be that much cheaper and faster to build. And we know that in part because that's how it worked out in China.
Mm-hmm. Just for the audience, I'm not as familiar with this nomenclature as you are and the types. Can you talk a little bit more about small modular reactors? Because that was supposed to be, the coming thing a decade or so ago. And China seems to have gotten a head start on that as well.
That's right. So small modular reactor defines a broad family of different technologies. It is typically something in the hundreds of megawatts range, as opposed to like an AP1000, which is 1100 megawatts, so over 1 gigawatt. But it is above 50 megawatts, because below 50 megawatts gets into what are broadly called the micro reactors. So small doesn't always define size. This is one of the challenges with small modular reactors. It actually defines the power output. But the modular is really the operative thing there. And the belief with them was that, we needed to start making nuclear reactors more like building an airplane than an airport. And that we would be able to get the cost down through assembly line repetition, and by having these smaller units, so you had to buy 6 at a time rather than just one big one. Within that category, then there are different types of technologies. So the one type of SMR technology that is approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States is by a company called NuScale. They have essentially just shrunken down a pressurized water reactor, which is the same kind of technology that the AP1000 uses. Then there are the ones that are using this Generation 4 technology that has different types of coolants, be it a high temperature gas or liquid metal. And those include the TerraPower unit, the TerraPower model that Bill Gates is building or attempting to build out in Wyoming. It also includes some of these other companies, like the ones that Google and Amazon have invested in recently, and could be of great use. I think it's there's a lot of factional, internecine debates and fights within the industry and within the world of advocacy with this stuff over what technology is best. But from what I can tell as a layperson with no stake in it, other than that I'm interested, I think that there are a number of different potential uses for these different technologies. And, certainly I did some reporting as well, helped, supported by the East-West Center in the Philippines and its, nuclear ambitions this past year. And, in the Philippines, they would, some advocates of nuclear power there would really like an AP1000 for the main island to help to fuel the growing electricity needs of the Manila megacity. But, on a smaller island like the island of Palawan, which has a smaller grid and thus smaller needs, something like an SMR would be ideal. So, I think all of these technologies are going to kind of see their uses. But in China, because they have this centralized national grid that can ship power all around, and they have ever-growing needs that are still being met in many places by coal, and thus sort of illustrating how big their needs are. I think nuclear power or these large reactors are a bit more useful in the Chinese context.
So they haven't decided to make a bet, as it were, on SMRs.
So they've been building this and kind of making history with their SMR in Hainan. It isn't actually that small. It is kind of the size of some regular reactors in the US and elsewhere, but it's been widely perceived to be a product for export more so than domestic use.
Yeah, because as you said, the idea is to build airplanes, not airports. So, I mean, this is, how many countries is China active in right now in terms of its exports of nuclear power plants?
One. So it built a couple of Hualong 1 reactors in Karachi, Pakistan. That went, they're online and they work. They haven't really gone beyond that just yet, but they are perceived to be quite interested. I mean, there are public statements from the chairman of CNNC, one of the two largest nuclear utilities in China, talking about the promise of exports in the coming years. And they are, quite keenly looking at a number of markets, including in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a lot of competition to see who will build Nigeria's first nuclear plant, Ghana's first nuclear plant. They're also looking, potentially in parts of Central Asia with Kazakhstan, which is, considering lifting its ban on having nuclear power and building a reactor there, and is sort of increasingly interested in asserting its sovereignty away from Russia, which is the dominant exporter of nuclear technology worldwide. Right. Turkey is another potential market where Russia is still building the first nuclear power plant there. And actually Saudi Arabia, which is one of the more interesting ones, because Saudi Arabia really wants to build its first nuclear power plant, much as the Koreans helped the Emiratis to do in Abu Dhabi. But the Saudis don't really want to comply with all of the stipulations about the nuclear fuel supply chain that the United States put on them. So China is an interested partner there.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that's a complicating factor for the U.S. worldwide, right? Roy Panzarella asks if the Chinese are experimenting with molten salt reactors.
The main type of Gen 4 reactor that they have pursued was a high temperature gas cooled reactor rather than molten salt. Although, while it didn't come up in my reporting, I would be surprised if they weren't seriously considering and looking at those things. Notably, they're looking at other types of reactors that are, perhaps even more theoretical than a molten salt reactor, which, is a more common type of design that could be used and is being pursued in the United States. So that includes thorium reactors. Thorium has kind of been this holy grail a little bit for nuclear power for quite some time. And, the Chinese are both working on a thorium reactor, potentially in the deserts out in Western China. And there's discussion about thorium reactor powered shipping vessels that would help to, decarbonize some of the, shipping industry that is so reliant on super polluting bunker fuel.
So in China, just to understand the industrial structure, who owns these power plants, and who are they separate from the companies that build them, and are these state-owned enterprises or some hybrid of the two?
So they're state-owned enterprises. They are largely built. They have different contractors that sometimes come in and do some of this work, and laborers, but they tend to be under the vertically integrated utilities like CNNC and CGN, the two largest nuclear utilities. Those are both state-owned enterprises. But in some cases, China seems to be opening up to some other Chinese companies buying shares in future reactors in order to help with the cost of those in the long term, particularly as they look to potentially liberalize some of their electricity markets. So that model is slightly changing, but for the most part, the answer is that they're state-owned
and state finance too. I mean, this is part of like all the infrastructure in China.
That's correct.
You were describing how China's grid is changing. Is there really that much difference between a huge coal-fired plant and a nuclear plant in terms of the grid? I know it's important for solar and wind to have a different sort of a more different networks, but does it really matter, nuclear or coal-fired, what kind of grid you have?
It's a great question, because the answer is no, and this is one of the benefits to nuclear power. Transitioning from a a grid that's built around coal, like most grids are, like our grid is here in the United States, to renewables is a huge challenge because you have very different types of needs for these weather-dependent, wind and solar farms. Whereas a nuclear reactor works in much the same way that coal does. It's both thermal energy. You're creating a bunch of heat. In one case, it's from, a fission reaction from splitting, uranium-235 atoms. In the other case, it's from burning, coal. But then that heat is creating steam, which is then used to spin turbines and create kinetic energy that makes electricity. So they function quite similarly. And notably, there's a term a term of art in electricity called capacity factor that I always like to point out to people when trying to make them understand the benefits of nuclear power. So, this describes the frequency with which the generating asset is actually generating electricity for you. So for a solar panel, it's like on average 25% of the time. So 75% of the time, it's not producing electricity. For a wind turbine, it's like 35% of the time. For a natural gas-fired power plant, it's like 50 to maybe 70% of the time. With a coal plant, it's like 80 to 85% of the time. And with a nuclear reactor, I mean, it depends how you run it. But in the United States, for example, it's like 95 to 97% of the time. And that other 3% is typically just planned outages for maintenance or refueling. So you can see from those numbers, the similarity in the way that both of those energy sources behave.
So another question from Bev Burden. Can you comment on a Chinese consortium working on developing fusion reactors?
Yeah. So China had a big breakthrough with its some of its fusion energy work recently, and they are, according to some satellite images that were reviewed by Reuters in the past 2 months, I believe, appear to be building an even larger plant to start generating, or experimenting with fusion energy. I think it's important to kind of note where things are globally with this technology. I mean, the big breakthrough came a couple of years ago at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California, where, for the first time ever, a fusion reaction generated more energy than it took to start. It only lasted for a fraction of a second. And that program actually is designed around weapons, not really around civilian energy usage. Nevertheless, this has really sparked a big rush in private investment among venture capitalists in the United States into fusion startups, many of which are making these claims about, having the first fusion power plants going in the 2030s. I would view those claims very skeptically. I would say so because when you look at the way that nuclear fission works, and some of these new next generation reactors in the fission world in the US are based on reactors that have been built before in like the 50s and the 60s, and yet there are all these struggles to get them going and to figure out the right design that works commercially and works technically. So fusion, there was another example where a couple of years ago I was moderating a panel in Lisbon with about fusion investment, and there was a German fusion scientist there, and she was talking about how that big breakthrough in fusion energy what happened from a laser-based fusion where and only about 25% of all the global resources invested in fusion were experimenting with laser fusion. Everything else was this magnetic fusion that you may have seen, like these donut-shaped reactors called tokamaks. And so, that tokamak design isn't the thing that actually yielded the breakthrough. And she said that, in order to create a single reactor using this laser fusion, you needed about like 200 to 300 of these high-powered lasers per reactor. And do you know how many of those lasers are produced worldwide right now? About 1 per year. So, the supply chains needed just to have the equipment and the materials to build fusion power plants are not even close to being there yet. So even if the technology and everything else was there to make it happen, I just don't think that the actual supply chains are even close to existing yet. But if there's anywhere that might be able to get those things going quickly, it is China with its industrial clusters and its industrial policies. So perhaps we'll end up seeing it there first.
All right, I'm gonna just one more question, then it's been terrific. And by the way, people were talking about fusion back in 1979 as well. It's one of those great receding horizons that, it's just over the hill. Anyway, one last one from Sanskriti Yadav, which is interesting. How is China's reputation, how does it affect its export capability vis-a-vis, say, France or the United States in terms of, how it deals with, well, quality control for one thing, but also, it's, in general?
This is an excellent question because this may be one of the biggest hurdles for China. China has something going for it similar to the Russians, which is that they can offer state-backed loans at competitive rates and at typically much cheaper prices per reactor than the United States or France or even the South Koreans might be able to offer. But when you sell a nuclear reactor to another country, you are entering into what could be, at the very least, a century-long relationship. Modern nuclear plants are with the life extensions, are going potentially for up to 80 years, maybe with ones that are built now, we'll see them last even longer than that. And if you consider construction, a full lifetime of operations, and then decommissioning, that easily can be more than a century, to say nothing of like who you're buying the fuel from, who you're turning to if there's any problems. So, that is a really long-term relationship that you're going into. And, for my story, I ended up, interviewing these different students from foreign countries who were studying at Tsinghua University in Beijing. One of them was from Ghana. The other one was from Sri Lanka. And, the Sri Lankan woman, said to me that, she was gravely concerned by the possibility of China becoming the vendor of choice for Sri Lanka because she has these, the pretty bad taste in her mouth from, a lot of this Belt and Road infrastructure that was built by China in Sri Lanka. And when Sri Lanka fell into a bad cycle of debt, they ended up, taking control of some Sri Lankan ports, basically as payment for that debt. So, that kind of debt trap narrative is something that has definitely followed China around a bit, and I think would be, a significant barrier to China with the exports currently, because these are such expensive pieces of, infrastructure mega projects.
Right.
So I would expect that would be an issue, but again, the need for this type of technology is growing, and if the U.S. and countries in the West can't really get their act together, and if they can't offer competitive prices and figure out some kind of financing mechanism that makes them competitive, then I think China has a pretty big opening, especially if it continues with these kinds of soft power initiatives, be them around clean energy generally, or even just being a hub for nuclear education for foreign students, like which have these.
Yeah, very good point. And if they're producing, again, something that is replicable, and not, the technology becomes firmly implanted. So they, Anyway, well, Alex, is terrific. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And I certainly hope to follow your research, your reporting into this in the future, because it's a very, very underreported, undercovered topic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for listening to me. And if you want to follow some of my reporting, I pretty regularly update my Substack newsletter on this stuff, and you can find that at just my last name, Kaufman.substack.com.
Okay, terrific. I'll do that.